Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and before I introduce tonight's guest, I just want to let you all know that on Saturday night at Washington Street Coffee House, the Greens are having a spring equinox party with Dog Bite, Golden Ratio, and Baird Welch Collins providing music. It'll be fun. More information is out on our website at nlgreens.org. So, with that out of the way, tonight's guest is Tim Hanser. I think most of you know Tim. But the purpose of tonight's show is to review the New London budget process because it is getting to be that time of year that we're thinking about the next fiscal year. So welcome, Tim.
Thanks.
And okay, so what are we going to do here tonight?
So I put together a couple slides to talk about what the process is, what's in the budget. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to do this was because having done the budget for a department for several years, it became apparent that there was a lack of understanding from people just because it's never been explained to them. So I thought it would be good to explain what's in a budget, what process is necessary to kind of get through to actually have a budget adopted. And then we could talk a little bit about what some patterns have been with budgets and taxes over the last few years.
Okay, so this is kind of a tutorial on the process and background for all of you people out there who want to look at the budget and scrutinize it, a way to do it in an organized way.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get to it.
Okay. So I've got a couple slides. So we'll start with just a quick summary. So what's in the annual budget? We have expenditures, we have revenues, and we have position control. So one thing that's absolutely necessary, is imperative, is that the expenditures not exceed revenues, and that revenues be at least as much as expenditures. Revenues can obviously exceed expenditures. Expenditures can be less than revenues, but they can't be the other way around. And the other piece, I think this is something that's lost often in the discussion, is there's a position control table included in the budget, and it lists every single position in the city of New London, on the city side, not the Board of Ed side, that is funded through this budget. And it actually lists the salary for each position. It doesn't list names, but it lists the position title and the salaries. So any additions to that list would have to go through some sort of amendment process. And I think it's an important detail that's not talked a lot about. So I wanted to...
Yeah, and that is one point. I know when I was on the Board of Ed, it really, I was really impressed in a way at how much of the budget you don't have discretion with, and a lot of it is because of the cost of the positions, and many of them are union. You have to abide by contract guidelines. Any raise and benefit differences, you don't have any wiggle room.
Right, and the budgets, municipal budgets, public sector budgets are really labor intensive. The services that are provided are really labor intensive. Education is an extremely labor intensive process. You have a lot of teachers, you have all the support staff. Police and fire departments are extremely labor intensive. There really aren't efficient ways to dramatically decrease the reliance on labor. And labor is expensive. No matter where you are, if it's public sector or private sector, labor is expensive. And I think that's one thing to bear in mind, that automation is not something that we can really employ effectively for things like police, fire, and even education, which are three of the biggest portions of our budget, and pretty much anybody's budget.
Okay, so
we'll kind of go into a little bit about about the expenditures, and it's just a rough breakdown. So there's three categories for expenditures. You have general government expenditures, which is about 45% of the total. Debt service, which is payment on all the different loans and debt that the city has, which is about 5 to 6% of the total. And Board of Education, which is about 48% of the total. Now this is just a snapshot. This is not, this ebbs and flows, it goes up, it goes down based on decisions and policies set by the city council and by the mayor. This is a snapshot from the fiscal year of 2015. You could see 5 of the largest contributors for the general government. Fringe benefits are actually the largest. So it's not which kind of talks about how labor is expensive. And those are commitments that even with reductions in force don't go down as much as one might think. Police is second with 10%, and then Public Works and Fire are about the same at 7%. And the one I put up there I thought was useful was utilities. This is just the electricity, the heating, the street lights, traffic signals. That consumes 2% of our budget, which is a lot considering it doesn't seem to. We don't necessarily think about it as providing a service, but it is a huge portion of the budget relative to what we
if you
would
look
expect.
at the dollars involved, it's a lot of money.
It is a lot of money. So that's the expenditure side of the budget. The revenue side of the budget, we have revenue streams from various sources. Again, these are snapshots from 2015. These numbers go up and down as ratios. Property taxes are 56% of the budget. Of that, or of the total, 47% is real estate tax, and the remainder is made up with personal property, motor vehicle, and there's some miscellaneous fees that are in there as well. Then there's intergovernmental revenues, and that's kind of a fancy way of saying state aid. It's mostly from the state. There's some amount that comes from federal government. There's small amounts that come from other towns and from services that we provide. They're very small. Those don't really come up for much. That's 38% of our budget, and we'll talk about it later, but that number is shrinking, which is part of what we're seeing with challenges. And then there's a hodgepodge of charges for services, things like permits, through planning and zoning, through the clerk's office, through the building inspector's office. Those account for about 4 to 5%. We get a small amount from fines and penalties, permits and licenses, and miscellaneous. Those three combined are probably a little bit more than 1%, but not much.
So really, those are not the answer to any of our revenue problems.
No, it would be great to find ways to maybe get those numbers up so we can get some of the other numbers down, but it's not going to change our world.
So okay, so that's the revenue side, and you did make the point that revenues need to be equal to or exceed expenditures, which you'd think would be obvious.
Right, it would be obvious, and this is obviously in the budget process. So even if there's a decision made that the city will take from fund balance to cover expenditures, that still has to be accounted for as a revenue. That would be under a transfer line. It would probably be under it'd probably fall under the miscellaneous category that's on that table. Even that has to be accounted for. We have to account for every dollar we're spending, and we have to find ways to cover each dollar that's spent. Obviously, by the end of the year, we don't know. A year and a half after the process, we don't know if we're going to hit the number 100% perfect. The idea is that we have to get close to that and not exceed the expenditures and make sure we're getting those revenues.
So what happens if we don't?
What we don't is what's happened in the past, and that's when the city has to make a decision about whether it's going to provide a special assessment, which would be actually a second tax bill.
Which happened a few years ago, right?
There was a proposal for one. I'm trying to remember if there actually was one. I don't recall. But the other option is to take from fund balance. There's reasons sometimes we don't get revenues. Sometimes the state commits to funds and then backs out because of their own problems, and that leaves the city holding the bag and making a decision. Do they want to still provide the services, or do they want to cut back the services? If they want to provide the services, they have to find alternative revenue streams.
Now you mentioned that on the city budget, every single position is listed. Is that information going to be available to the public when the budget is proposed?
It should be. Last year's budget, when it was presented to the council, those were the last pages in the budget book, and those budget books are certainly available to the public. Hopefully we'll have them available on the city's website. When I did some looking, preparing for this discussion, I didn't find the complete package on the city's website. I happen to have a copy of my own, so I was able to reference that. But I'm hoping that we have easy access through the website.
So do you want to talk now about what the basic steps are of the process, and then we can talk about the details of what might be in different lines?
Sure. So there's 5 basic steps. I can get into a lot more detail, but I think this covers
And we might
the
get
basics pretty
actually,
well. at least as a starting point. 4 of them are dictated by charter. One of them is something that's determined by how the mayor wants to operate it. So the first step is the department heads submit budget requests to the mayor's office. The mayor is the one who determines when that happens, what he's looking for in that request. I know when I was running the Public Works Department, these requests were things we had to have submitted by January. So the process for the department starts in December or January, which, when you think about it, that's 18 months from when the budget ends. So that's why it can be challenging to hit those numbers on the head in terms of, in retrospect.
As part of the mayor requesting this information from department heads, how much direction would a mayor typically give as to what kind of things they want to see in the budget?
My experience was that it varies. It varied from year to year. Some years were, I want a specific no greater than X amount increase, but you can figure out how to get to that number however you'd like, or I want these specific positions added, or I want these positions eliminated, or I want this added or this removed. It really depends on the year. It really depends on who's the mayor. Every mayor is going to take this on a little bit differently.
And we have a new mayor this year, so we don't know.
We have, not only do we have a new mayor, but we have a new chief administrative officer who I'm sure is assisting him in this process, as well as a new finance director who is integral to the process. So it's not just one person has changed, actually 3 people have changed. So that's, I'm sure they're working very hard on it. They should be just wrapping it up right now. But how that process is working right now has some variance, I'm sure.
Okay, so back to the steps.
Sure, yeah. So the next step after that is that the mayor has to submit the proposed budget to the city council. Now, this is actually dictated by charter. The charter says that it has to be submitted to the council 90 days before the beginning of the fiscal year.
Which is July 1st.
July 1st is the beginning of the fiscal year. So depending on how you count, and I'm sure there's a legal opinion on this, that number can either be April 1st, April 2nd, or April 3rd. It's very clear it's not any time later than that. That said, the mayor could have presented the budget March 1st if he so chose.
So that's the deadline, the
Right.
90 days.
Yeah, there is no window of opportunity. It's more like you have a deadline, you have to get it by that time. After that step, the council deliberates over the budget, spends a fair amount of time talking to the department heads to understand what's in the budget. They have to get their recommendations in the form of 2 ordinances, one for the Board of Ed and one for the city general government. They need to present those recommendations to the Board of Finance not later than 60 days before the start of the fiscal year, which works out to be May 3rd. Now, the step after that is the public hearing, which I don't have on this slide, but that fits in with the Board of Finance recommendations. There's a public hearing actually that is done by the Appropriations Board. Now, the Appropriations Board has one function and one function only, which is to oversee the budget. The Appropriation Board is made up of the 7 counselors,
Okay.
plus the 5 members of Board of Finance. So it's just a fancy way of saying these 2 have a joint meeting. And
Okay.
there's discussions about the budget. The Board of Finance makes recommendations. Their recommendations can range from, we approve this 100%, no changes need to be made, to a whole litany of changes they want to make. And that needs to be given back to the City Council by May 17th.
Now, you mentioned public hearing. In the past, there have been separate public hearings for the city side and the Board of Ed side. I'm guessing that if it's 2 separate ordinances, there are likely to be 2 separate public hearings?
The charter is silent on the issue. I imagine from a noticing perspective, they both have to be listed. From a time perspective, I'm sure it would be
Right.
wise to separate them, just because the anticipated comment from the public on the 2 different ordinances, but there is no requirement that they
Oh.
be separate.
Okay.
So I guess the last step of the process is the Board of Finance provides their recommendations to the council. The council needs to make final approvals of the 2 ordinances. Now, their approvals cannot exceed the numbers that the Board of Finance approved. It can be
Okay.
less than, but it cannot exceed that.
So they can change and they can go with the same number or decrease it.
Right, but they cannot increase it. If they do, they have to go back to the Board of Finance, which obviously if their May 3rd deadline is passed, I would think they would be in violation of the charter. So the council has to make that final approval by vote by June 1st, and that's when they present it to the mayor, and the mayor has this is now just the process for signing
Right.
an ordinance, whether the mayor can sign it and it becomes law. He can not sign it and a certain amount of time passes and it becomes law, or he can veto it, and he has fairly broad line item veto powers, and then has to send it back to the council, and he has a certain time frame to do that.
So let's say the most complicated scenario is the mayor vetoes and recommends changes.
Which I believe happened last year.
I think that is true. So now, do the mayor's changes also have to be lower than the original number?
The mayor cannot increase it above
Okay.
that number, to the best of my knowledge. A line item veto, generally speaking, at any
Is
level of budget,
eliminating
yeah,
expenses.
right. Or in some cases, it can mean moving them around, but it cannot. The total bottom line number cannot change, cannot increase, I should say.
So then it would go back to the council.
It'll go back to the council. They have two options. They can make changes and send it back to the mayor for approval, or they can override his veto. And to override a veto, there needs to be 6 votes for override, which is what happened last year. I believe it actually, was it over? I'm trying to remember if it was unanimous or if it was 6-1.
I don't remember which, but
But the veto was overridden.
it was overridden. Okay, so at the end of that council meeting, though, there's closure.
There is closure, and there's the whole process of referenda, which we haven't gone into, which is the same for any council action. Members of the public can petition for the council to reconsider. They have 15 days to submit a petition. It has to be 10% of the number of people who voted in the previous municipal election, so that was last fall's election. They believe that number for 10% is 340.
And I think it usually does range somewhere in the 300 to 400.
Right.
Just quite a few signatures, but it is not unheard of for citizen groups to collect that many.
No, I believe for the budget, in the last 5 years, it's been petitioned at least 3 times. So it's a fairly frequent occurrence that does happen. And of course, when that happens, there's delays in the budget process, and there are mechanisms within the charter and within the ordinances to allow for the government to continue to function without a budget in place after July 1st. There's restrictions, but I think the argument is that we can't shut down government 100% just because because there needs to be some changes made. I don't think there's anybody in the public who would advocate for a complete shutdown of the city's government just because there's no budget approved.
A lot of trash would accumulate.
It's not just trash. I mean, it's police, it's fire, it's education. I know summer is not necessarily the busiest time for school, but there's a lot of basic services that would not be tended to, which would really put the city at a lot of risk.
And then at that point, if there is a petition and enough New London citizens sign it, then there's the question of when the actual vote will take place.
Right, the referendum vote, which I believe when it was 2013's budget, fiscal year 12-13, that vote did not take place until after the fiscal year closed. And the reason was the calendar works out in such a way that it just wasn't terribly feasible. It wasn't feasible, I should say, by the law to actually use the machines for that fall because there's requirements about them being locked up a certain amount of time before and after an election. So that was a very interesting moment in time.
I'm sure, because I don't know how the budget turned out at the end of that year, but I imagine there was a lot of scrambling.
There was, and at the end of the day, it was approved. It was a bit of a moot point, but it was approved. There was a lot of discussion about what is to be done if it's not approved and how does that actually even get addressed at that point. I don't know if there was really an answer. And we didn't have to go down that road. And hopefully we don't in the future either.
So, well, let's go back to the slides. And the next subject I think you were going to talk about was the mill rate, which is always quite a hot topic.
Sure.
In New London.
Sure. So the mill rate is calculated through a fairly what looks to be a fairly simple formula, but there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes of those numbers. So the mill rate is simply the tax warrant divided by the taxable grand list. A tax warrant is how much revenue needs to be raised by property taxes to cover the budgeted expenditures for the year. So it's basically taking the total expenditures that are approved by the budget, subtracting out all of the other revenue sources, and in many cases, some other small allowances that are used for non-budgetary purposes. For example, there is an ordinance that allows for relief, property tax relief for the elderly, and there is a line item for that that's not in the budget itself, but that is in the calculation for the tax warrant. I believe it's about $375,000. These aren't making enormous changes, but I think last year the difference between the amount of money that needed to be raised to cover the budget versus how much needed to be raised for the tax warrant equated to about 1 mil of revenue. So it's not a huge percentage of the total cost. And then the grand list is another variable. It can go up, it can go down. As we saw in the last revaluation, it went down significantly.
It went down a lot.
This year it went up. It went up 3.5%, almost exclusively because Electric Boat's property is now being assessed at its full, it's being taxed at its full assessment. I don't believe there was any other growth within the city. Those play huge roles in how our tax rate is set, beyond just how much money the city has budgeted for expenditures.
Now that is one of the challenges when you're so dependent on a big property owner like EB. And we have a couple of big property owners, the couple of shopping plazas. But something goes sour with one of those properties and, it's a huge, it makes a huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely, especially since we have a property tax system that relies heavily on the improvements to the property as opposed to the land itself. So if if an entire apartment complex, which is one of the largest taxpayers in the city, I believe it's called Nutmeg Woods, but up north of 95, if it were to have a terrible fire and the whole thing were to be leveled, its assessment would drop dramatically and it would be a huge loss of tax revenue to the city.
So is it time to talk about alternatives? Perhaps, I know that several years ago, around 2009 or 10, the city was considering a land value pilot, which would have allowed a split rate.
Right.
And more of the land would be taxed, more than the improvements on it. Looking at the revenue side of things, is that a way that we can provide a little less volatility in our grand list?
It certainly does, because you're not relying on the improvements to the property. You're relying on kind of the inherent value of its location. And as they say in real estate, location, location, location. It's really based on the level of service that area is provided, where it's located relative to valued assets such as the water, such as maybe the train station, whatever it might be that's considered a valuable asset. The numbers are already actually calculated. If anybody looks at their assessment, the land's value is already assessed, or it's already appraised, I should say. So there's not even a process that has to be changed, just a formula.
I know we had done the math at one point of a couple of properties that were near each other but had very different conditions of properties. One looking at both the Cronin and the Bacon building downtown,
Right.
which have nearly the same footprint, are both very close to the center of the city. Actually, I think the Cronin building is a little closer to the train station, maybe a little bit more prime location. And yet, because of the relative conditions of the building, I think the Bacon building owners pay 3 times the property tax.
Right, and and I know there's been comparisons done throughout the city that have shown the same issue. The current system, in a lot of ways, incentivizes people to not maintain their properties. Now, there's obviously, everybody has a sense of, or most people have a sense of pride of place.
Right.
They maintain their property because they live there, because they want to value it. But with the number of vacant properties in the city and number of properties that need a lot of work, what our system currently does is it implicitly rewards them for allowing their properties to decay. And really, we're also penalizing those who are making improvements. It seems a little backwards. It seems like we would want to do it the other way around. It's certainly something we could still look at. I believe the city still has the opportunity to pursue that. I don't know if there needs to be new legislation, but
Yeah,
it's an opportunity to at least take care of some of this volatility. It's not really a revenue raiser. It's not changing that dynamic, but it at least is creating a little more stability.
Now, well, first of all, I want to invite people to call in if they have questions.
Sure.
But then I wanted to ask, you mentioned about state money that comes in through both ECS and Pilot and probably other programs. And you mentioned that that number is shrinking. So what is the impact and how can we meet that challenge?
Sure, just so first to kind of talk about what the trend has been, I looked at the last 7 years of budgets and looked at the property tax revenue that's generated as well as the total expenditures by year. I benchmarked those numbers to 2015 dollars so that we basically take out the factor of inflation. And what you see is a pretty notable upward trend in terms of how much our budget is being paid for out of property taxes, even when you can kind of balance out what our expenditures are. So if we could pull that slide up.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you.
So, oh, good, okay. So if you look, I think that the two I really wanted to point out, but just to kind of walk people through the slide, since I've looked at this several times, I know it takes a minute. The first column just lists the fiscal year from July 1 to June 30th of the following year, the amount of property tax revenue raised in those years, benchmarked to 2015 dollars. Just to note, the 2014-15 budget and 15-16, those are budgeted figures as opposed to actuals. All the other numbers are actually audited actual data. The expenditures benchmarked to 2015 dollars. And again, 14-15, 15-16 are budgeted as opposed to actuals. The rest are all audited values. And then the percentage from property tax. And I think that the two numbers that jumped out at me that I think were noteworthy and worth discussing to kind of show this pattern is if you look at 2009 to 2010 and compare it with 2014 to 2015. If you look at the expenditures column, in 2009-2010, there was expenditures of $84,458,848. And in 2014-15, $85,372,000.
So less than $1 million difference.
Less than $1 million difference. So it's about a 1% increase in spending. And it goes, in terms of property tax, it goes to from 50.9% to 55.7%, which is a 10% increase. So we had a 1% increase in expenditures in real dollars, but we had a 10% increase in how much of that was being paid out of property taxes.
So what were we losing?
The majority of, and I'm going to go to the next slide, which is a repeat of an earlier slide. So this is the breakdown currently of where we get our money from. Oh, that's the wrong slide. Hang on. Where's my revenue slide? There it is. So if you look at these numbers, number 1 and number 2, property taxes and intergovernmental rental revenues, those are, as of 2015, 94% of our revenue streams. Now, that property tax number keeps going up, the intergovernmental revenue number keeps going down. Like I said before, intergovernmental revenue is a fancy word for state aid. So what's happening is that the state is providing less and less assistance to, not just to New London, to all the cities and towns in the state of Connecticut, because they have their own budget woes. And because they are trying to find ways to cut their expenditures. And really they're just saying, well, we're just going to pass the problem to somebody else.
Yes, as we mentioned beforehand, it's no shit rolling downhill.
And
And
unfortunately,
we're at the bottom.
and I'm sure if we were talking state budgets, we can look at intergovernmental revenues, meaning federal aid, and what you see over time is that number has decreased as well. So this is not simply the state passing the buck; it's the federal government passing the buck, and this has a trickle down effect. That at the end of the day, the places that really suffer the most are local government, and especially local government that is in an area that's distressed, that has challenges raising its own revenue because it's, in the case of New London, it has a very high percentage of non-taxable properties. It's also pretty fully developed, so there's really very little opportunity to grow the grand list in a kind of a natural, organic way. Those are real challenges that a place like New London faces, a place that Hartford faces, New Haven, pretty much any urban area in the state, and that extends to other places across the country.
Now, tax-exempt property is a real challenge, and some of the tax-exempt properties do really provide services mostly to New London residents, but many of them in New London, if you look at the colleges and you look at the hospital, they provide services regionally, or even in the case of like the Coast Guard Academy, nationally, and yet poor New London is subsidizing them. So is there a way out of this?
There's many opportunities. I don't know if there's a way out per se, but there are opportunities. I think one place we can look to is look at New Haven and look at New Haven's relationship with Yale. Now, nobody's going to confuse Yale with Connecticut College, and nobody's really going to confuse New London with New Haven. However, New Haven and Yale have come to an understanding to a certain degree that one needs the other, that Yale needs New Haven as much as New Haven needs Yale. And they have provided, Yale provides a fairly significant payment to the city of New Haven in lieu of taxes. In addition to providing other services, there's an organization that's based out of Yale called the Urban Resources Initiative. They do plantings along streets, they hire people and provide them training, but they also provide people who have checkered pasts with therapy. There was a great profile in the New Haven Register and I believe the Connecticut Mirror a couple weeks ago about this. They are finding ways not only to contribute through the actual fund transfers, but they're providing in-kind services as well, not only to the city, but to the residents of the city. It's certainly not the solution, but there's a real partnership there, and I think it has really enhanced areas of New Haven that weren't being really taken care of for many years.
And I can see that really working here. I've worked with volunteers from Conn College. I love the place, but they do own like nearly 1 square mile of our 6 square mile city. So the amount of property really impacts us. And it's also located in a part of the city that's very near parts of New London that are in very poor condition. So I'd love to see some kind of partnership that's increased from what OVCS is doing now and what some of the departments are doing with the Hodges Square revitalization.
Yeah, I think that's one. Partnerships and finding ways to get in-kind services is certainly one opportunity. It's not going to solve our puzzle, but it certainly helps. I think the other opportunity is to look at what other revenue streams we have available to us. In the state of Connecticut, local municipalities have very limited opportunity to raise revenue. It's pretty much limited to property tax, whether it be real estate or private property or motor vehicle. We don't have the legal right to raise a sales tax. We
Right.
don't have the right to have any sort of other taxation. We are wards of the state in many ways, and it's not just New London. The town of Greenwich is also a ward of the state in that regard as well. And we have to find ways to work with the state to allow other revenue opportunities that allow us to fund basic services. We're not talking about luxuries. We're talking about really basic services, public safety, public infrastructure, education.
Right.
We're not looking for gold-plated highways. We're just looking for basic maintenance.
So now the motor vehicle tax, I might be wrong, but you'll let me know if I am. People who live in towns with high mill rates pay on the same value car, but a higher mill rate, right? We get penalized.
As of the last time I checked, that was the case.
That is true.
I know there's been discussions about somehow finding a way to make that change. That, of course, would require some sort of subsidy from the state.
Right.
When we know the state's budget situation, we know their financial situation, and quite frankly, we know their history of not coming through with those commitments. So to the best of my knowledge, the current situation is what you described. My 2013 Mazda that's sitting outside, I pay more in taxes than somebody who owns an identical car but lives
Even in Waterford.
in Waterford, where we're sitting right now.
5 minutes away.
5 minutes.
So, so that trickles down to us as well, not just high property tax on our homes, which is partly offset, I think, because the assessments of our homes tend to be a little lower than in some of the lower tax towns.
No, absolutely, and there's been plenty of analysis on what goes into the value of a home, and taxes play a role. That higher taxes do have some impact on lowering values of homes. Good schools raise the values, proximity to features like the water raise values, things like that. So, but taxes definitely do play a role in terms of offsetting it. So while you may end up paying more in taxes, you're paying less on a mortgage. So there's a trade-off. It's not necessarily a good trade-off or a bad trade-off, but there is somewhat of a trade-off.
Now, one of the things we found in the New London budget is at the end of the year, we see some department overruns. And they can be, I'm sure they're frustrating for the people who are responsible for balancing the budget. So what can be done on the administrative side to alleviate that?
That's a good question. So when I ran the Public Works Department, I walked in the door in December of 2011, and the first document that was provided to me was expenditures through that date, as well as projections for the year. And I was told that we're projected to have a $700,000 deficit for the year, and this is on an $8 million budget. And to kind of highlight,
This is at the end of 5 months of
within 5 months, we already were running at a pace of a $700,000 deficit. Now, to kind of highlight, the one line I like to share with people to kind of highlight really the dire situation we were in was the buildings maintenance division overtime budget was already spent. The first 5 months, they spent 12 months worth of overtime. So there wasn't any wiggle room. It was very clear from the day I got there wasn't any wiggle room. So what I implemented, starting that year and continuing for my entire tenure, was that we did monthly expenditure reports, that we had meetings about the monthly expenditure reports. We talked about ways to reduce costs without loss of service or service quality. And that first year we got from $700,000 projected as a deficit to about $150,000 deficit. Still a deficit, but considering we had 6.5 months, 7 months to figure this out before winter even hit, I think we did pretty well. The following year, I was told by the mayor there would be overruns in other budgets, that I had to find a 5% reduction in my budget, and we did. And we did it through this process. If a department has the mindset that they will not spend the money, you start changing the conversations about how money gets spent.
So how do you prioritize?
I think so the department head cannot possibly know the entire operation. I know it's not realistic, that's not their job. This is why you have managers. The managers know what their operations look like. You have to engage your managers. You need buy-in. If you don't have the buy-in, this is a very difficult process, and it's going to be all through mandates and policies and memos, and nobody's going to be happy, and you probably won't achieve your goal either. So really, it has to be a discussion about what's important, not only to the department, but also to the people who are receiving the services, the public, and how can we find savings, little savings here, little savings there. If it's $500, it's $500. $500 10 times starts to add up. You have to find ways to do it, but there has to be a real commitment. There has to be a spirit of doing it, and there has to be a real commitment from the top down.
And we need it in every department.
I think so. So this report that we put together was an expenditure report, and I say expenditure report because I think it's there's a difference between an expenditure report and an expense report, and that may seem like I'm just using two synonyms, but an expenditure is a commitment to funding, to a payment. It's a commitment. Expense is what's already been spent. So we did expenditure reports because expense reports were not reliable. You could have a $20,000 bill for a plumbing emergency that hasn't gone through accounting, so the check hasn't cleared, but you spent the money. So you better have that on your expenditure report, otherwise your data is not accurate. And the reason I made that such an important piece was when you do that and you're consistent and you're making sure you're doing the expenditures, you can create 12 monthly expenditure reports for the year, and then the following year you can look at the August report from the year before, as well as the June report, which is the year-end report, and compare it to your August report from that current year and say, okay, this is where I am compared to last year. This is where we ended up with this in this account. Do I need to worry about where we are, so that I knew how much time needed to be spent on that account line? It's a lot of work. It's a real commitment, but as soon as you get rolling, the amount of information that you can glean from it and the decisions that can be made to find savings are huge.
Now, this is kind of a specific question, but it always seems to be a question whether it's better to have people working overtime or to hire new employees, whichever of the big departments we're talking about. But we hear about it a lot in both the fire department and the police department. How does the math work?
That's a good question, and I wish I knew the answer. So this was a question I had asked on several occasions myself to understand how to make decisions like that, and I was never provided with the information. The difference is the fringe benefits. What are you paying? What does it cost to hire somebody? What of those costs do you not incur when you pay them overtime? What percentage of their total cost is that? And that will be the factor to determine whether it's cheaper to hire or cheaper to use overtime. It's not necessarily a straightforward formula, but it's certainly something that can be figured out. That's where getting the finance director and the finance department involved with those discussions can really be helpful. And I think the public wants to hear it. I mean, there was a huge issue last year. Several people who raised a lot of concerns about overtime spending primarily in the police and fire departments. And those are legitimate concerns. Now, for all I know, it was cheaper to do that than to hire the staff. But until that information is out there, the public is going to make the assumption that the overtime is kind of padding. It's money that we could have spent better other ways, particularly through hiring more people. And so that information is really valuable for the public to know, so they know that their money is being spent in as efficient a manner as possible.
And I'm guessing that one of the confounding factors is that a new hire starts out at the bottom of the pay scale, but the person earning overtime might be, their hourly rate might be high, so their time and a half rate might be really high.
It does create a complication. Probably not as, it really depends on where the person works. In the case of the police department, a first-year patrolman, overtime to fill that position could conceivably be filled by a captain, because the captain is in the same union. That's an enormous range of salaries. Whereas if you're talking about the fire department, the range is much smaller. Firefighter to firefighter, there is a range, but it's not as great. You're generally not going to hire an electrician to fill a custodial
Right.
overtime need. So it really does depend. But I think the other thing is that a lot of the costs are healthcare costs and things like that. Those are really irrelevant to what people get paid. It has everything to do with what their healthcare plan is, how many children they have, do they have a spouse? And those are things that you just have to work on averages.
Now, we have 5 minutes left, and so the last thing I want to ask you is, we're at the point in the budget process where the mayor will be presenting the budget soon, within a couple weeks. For people who are watching who want to do due diligence and look at what's presented, what would you recommend the steps they take?
I would get a copy of the budget. That should be something you can get through the city council. There are copies that are often available, or you can request them at the meeting when the mayor presents the budget. There are other opportunities to get them. The budget is a couple hundred pages. Most of it's the detail. You can look at the first 25 pages, which is still a lot of information, but that covers the revenue sources, the expenditures by source. It provides some level of information about changes over the course of a couple years. It provides a pretty good overall summary as to what's in that budget. That's a starting point. It's complicated, it's difficult, but asking questions, making sure your counselors ask the questions.
So if you see something, ask a counselor. Now, who is on the Board of Finance?
The Board of Finance?
Yeah, you had mentioned the Board of Finance.
You know,
I have
I don't
no
know
idea.
all 5 members. I know that they've had a history recently of having trouble getting a quorum.
That's what I had heard.
So I don't know if I've ever actually met all 5 members of the Board of Finance. Rob Funk is on the board. Lonnie Braxton used to be on the board. I think he's still on the board. Those are the only 2 that are coming to mind.
And Rob Funk actually would be a good person to ask because he is also a consultant for the school budget.
Right.
And so of all the people I can think of offhand who might have a good idea of what's in either of the budgets, he might have an idea.
And I could say of the Board of Finance members, Rob was the only one who attended all of the hearings. He attended every time there was a discussion with the council about the budget over the course of a few weeks. He was at those meetings so that he knew what was coming to him when he got to the Appropriations Board meeting, so he can make decisions fairly quickly, because there isn't they're not given very much time.
No, and I'm thinking now it's the Ides of March today, so really the clock is already ticking.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that I recommended last year as an improvement on the process, now it's not required by charter, but just as an improvement, is that if it was possible for the budget to be delivered to the council earlier, give them 2 more weeks. Give them the time to look at that budget, to ask the questions, whether the questions are done solely in the public meetings or if they're sending emails to the mayor or to the department heads to get clarity on things. What I saw every year was that decisions were being made, which are really consequential decisions, the last day, the deadline. Everything was done at deadline. That is not a recipe for making good decisions. In the fiscal year 12-13, that last day, I went in as a public works director to the meeting hiring people. I left the meeting having to lay people off. And the council didn't know because they didn't have the time, I didn't have the time to do the analysis, to say, okay, what did you just do? How much of an impact does this have on the budget? And that's to their disservice, that's to the department's disservice, but most importantly, it's to a disservice of the public.
Yeah, you need time to go over this stuff.
Right.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you, Tim. Maybe when the process is a little farther along, we'll talk about this year's budget.
Sure.
Next week, we're having a couple representatives from Eastern Connecticut Green Action, which is a group that's working to slow climate change in Eastern Connecticut through action of towns and the state. So we'll see you then. Thanks again, Tim.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all around New London. You see.